Okay, perfect. Well then, welcome everybody to the riveting conclusion of linguistic terminology. We were halfway through the section I called grammar last time, which is really a bit of a waste paper section where I put everything I didn't know where else to put. And the next thing I want to go through is some terminology you could use for Klingon suffixes. Some of these are common, some of these are not. This is again one of these cases where I'm trying to introduce all the terms that you might possibly hear. No guarantee I didn't forget one or two or just haven't heard them yet, but haven't heard them used yet, but it's the attempt to be complete. So let's start with noun suffixes. The first one is already up, the augmentative a. So this is a common one. This is already, TKD calls it an augmentative. The important thing to remember with that is, yes, it augments something, but that doesn't mean it's only bigger. That is part of it, but other aspects include more important, more complete, more intense. In a lot of European languages that have augmentative, it often carries some negative connotations of lack of sophistication, roughness, that sort of thing. This is why I'm so fond of the example Toiwe A for an augmentative in Klingon, because it shows what else an augmentative can be. Because it's a possible, but maybe not the most expected meaning for an augmentative of the word servant. The opposite is the diminutive, chom. Again, this is the common expression for it. It makes things smaller, less important, less complete, not yet something. The third class one, a suffix that we call the endearment suffix, there isn't really a clever word for it, so to speak. No, not really a Latin term, because most languages do this with a diminutive. So if you speak German, for example, it would be very, both chom and oi partially map onto chen, for example. All right. Class 2 is just plurals. Class 3, which I'm kind of skipped here. So for na, there isn't really a good term. Che could be called a dubitative because you're doubting the identity of the thing you're talking about. Kok could be a different kind of dubitative because you're really saying, I don't believe it's what it is, or it's what I'm calling it. Dude kok, I'm really saying, I don't really believe this is a ship. I don't really consider this thing a ship. That's also a sort of dubitative. But I already put that in the moods because it's commonly a mood in most natural languages. Then we have the possessives. It's fairly clear from English. Possessives show possession, which in Klingon is done through a set of suffixes that map onto the grammatical persons. The other two type 4 suffixes would be called demonstratives. So demonstratives are words or modifiers that to indicate which entities are being referred to distinguish them from others. So, this pen versus that pen. And that's what Klingon, Vam, and Vet map to. And all of that is part of the larger concept of deixis or deixis. So, the noun is deixis or deixis. The adjective that goes with it is deictic or diictic. For some weird reason, I typically say deixis and deictic. It's just my idiosyncrasy. So it doesn't mean that's any more correct than anything else, just so you know what I'm saying for the rest. So deixis is the use of words or phrases to refer to a time, a place, a thing, a person, etc., relative to some reference point. So demonstratives like this and that are probably the best known cases of deixis, because usually, particularly that, has no real definition if you haven't used this before. If you haven't used the word this before. So this contrasting with that is really most of the case when that even has much of a meaning. Not that it isn't it's used a bit differently in English, in particular. So pronouns are also inherently deictic because who I is changes who is speaking, right? When I say I mean this person, the nerd in glasses that's talking to you. But if, taking you as an example, TJ is saying I, then she means another person. The person with the, I think, currently pink hair that is listening to this. Right? So pronouns are meaningless unless they have some sort of reference. That makes them inherently deictic. Locations and time words are part of this, as long as they describe a location or time with reference to something else. So on the street is not particularly deictic, but across the street really only has a meaning when I'm standing on one side of the street. So one side of the street being this, the side that where it originates, needs to be defined before across the street really has a meaning. So generally, deixis is split into levels, where proximal deixis refers to things that are close to me, so like this or these in English. Distal deixis is things that are far away, like that or those. Some languages add the medial in the middle, which is typically things that are close to the listener. That's, for example, how it is in Japanese. But you can have, was my example, Malagasy has 7 levels of deixis. So you can be really, I don't know how they work. I don't know Malagasy. This was an example I looked up. But you can be very, very detailed in how you refer to things. So this is an overall concept. Right, and in type 5s, we have mo, which is causal because it shows a cause. Vad is called benefactive. This is even in TKD, I think. Could also call it, because it marks the indirect object, you could call it the indirect object marker, or you call it dative, because dative usually, the noun case dative that we discussed last time, usually corresponds to the indirect object. Yeah, vo and dak are types of locations. We've been over that in the cases as well. And then we have which is topic or focus. Now this is a bit of a fun one. So topic, comment, or it's topic or focus, and theme and comment. These are really the same thing. It's a kind of structure in a language. So simply said, the topic or theme is what the sentence is about, whereas the comment or focus is what is said about the thing. So if I say, I don't have a book nearby, so this booklet here is black, then this booklet is what my sentence is about, so that would be the topic or theme, and the fact of it being black is what I say about it, so that is the focus or comment. Now, there are some languages where this distinction is far more coded into the grammar than it is in English. Japanese is one of them. So in English, really, this distinction can be made only from the meaning. And that's what gives us a bit of an issue here in Klingon. So TKD calls it the topic marker, but there are a few cases in canon where the usage is really more of a focus marker. So, for example, there is the sentence from the Rite of Ascension, Dachjad Shuwe Jich. Jich is what the sentence is about. Today, I am a warrior. This is about me. And the being a warrior is the focus. So there it marks focus or the emphasis. There was also an interview where somebody asked him, hey, isn't this rather a focus mark? He said yes. And a couple of weeks ago, we even had a huge discussion on this because I asked about it on the server where we couldn't get to any sort of agreement. So we continue to call it the topic marker because that's what TKD calls it, but it is sometimes a focus, also just used for emphasis. But yes, this topic comment, topic focus, damn it. Topic focus structure is where this terminology comes from. Okay, and then to verb suffixes. In class 1, we have the reflexive. Reflexive is what you do to yourself. The grammatical definition is that the subject and the object are the same in reflexive sentences or with reflexive verbs. If you've ever studied ancient Greek, it's the so-called middle voice between the active and the passive. And the other one there is chuk, the reciprocal. It's still a form of reflexive, and in some languages, these are actually the same form. So in Hebrew, for example, the same form can express either a reflexive or reciprocal. It's usually depending on the verb or depending on context, which one of these it is. So reciprocal is what a group of people does not to themselves, so not everybody does it, every member of the group does the same thing to themselves, but to one another. So the difference would be we wash ourselves suggests that every member of we washes their own body, whereas we wash each other would mean everybody helps somebody else wash. So that's called reciprocal, which I think maybe a little less in Klingon terminology. I'm not entirely sure. But yes, it's a similar thing because in a slightly different way, still the subject and the object are, let's say, the same group, because reciprocal only makes sense in the plural. In class 2, we just were discussing this a little before, is the ones that last time, these are a lot of suffixes that could be termed modal suffixes if you want to. They typically correspond to modal verbs. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure where I've heard this. I have definitely heard somebody call them that, but it's not general terminology. Right, and nish could be called, that again we covered in the moon, we had obligative or necessative because it shows an obligation or a necessity. But that's nish only. In type 3, you have the iterative, ka. So saying something is done again or re-begun. The term for that is iterative. And for choch, we could call it an inceptive. I've heard quite a few people call it that. However, you should be aware that this is a bit of an attackable position because choch has been defined as a change of state, which at least theoretically could also be ending something. So yeah, most of the time we use it for something beginning, which is what inceptive means. So, I wouldn't necessarily debate calling choch an inceptive suffix, but be aware that others might. Right, moch, the causative. I like that. Unfortunately, European languages have generally lost their causatives. So causative in general is something that expresses that an action is being caused. So I cause you to do something, I make you do something along those lines. Fun fact, the ancestor of English, Proto-Germanic, Proto-West Germanic, had a causative. And that's where we get verb pairs like rise and raise and fell from. So fell in this case is not the past tense of fall, but fell as in I fell. And I'm My gesture is cute here. I'm holding a tiny little axe. Yeah, but this is a common verb form in quite a lot of languages. And a fun one, frankly. So it's a bit, I'm always a bit sad that we don't have that anymore. Right. Type 5, lach, ability, could be another modal suffix if you want to. Lu is called the indefinite subject, or the marker for the indefinite subject. Of course, lu itself is not that indefinite subject. So this just means that the subject is indefinite, undefined. Indefinite is a bit of a wider term in grammar. So we also have indefinite articles, which is in English or an. So a book as opposed to the book. With a book, I don't know which one. My room's full of them. If I told you get me a book, you'd be looking around and saying, yeah, which one? And I'd have to say, I want, give me the book, or this book, and point to one. So that's indefinite. But there are also verbs that are, sorry, not verbs, words that are inherently indefinite. Something like vai, someone or something, or par, nothing, nobody, are typical example of indefinite words. And yeah, for translation, it usually maps fairly neatly onto the English passive. But if you want it to be entirely correct, the more technically accurate translation would be to do it with a sentence with one. So, velerlu would rather be, the English idiomatic translation is I am seen. The technically accurate translation would be one sees me, which in English always sounds a bit weird. There are some languages like German with man with one N, not with two, or the French on, that do this a little more readily. Oh yeah, so class 6, we have another dubitative with lau. Lau again could be termed a dubitative, and for the I don't know any terminology. 7 is the aspect. We've been over that. Let's not do it again. Class 8 nesh is called an honorific suffix. Again, this is fairly common terminology in Klingon. Honorific language is a really wide concept. So Klingon is being nice to us by just having one suffix to do it with, but some languages have extensive systems of honorific speech. Japanese is infamous for that. Basically, you have to learn an entire additional set of vocabulary to use honorific language. So yeah, it's a very general term for polite language, a bit more than polite. You're really showing some sort of deference to the person you're talking to. Right, and type 9, there are a few. So we have we and rach, which do something called substantivization, or more commonly nominalization. That's a general term for a process in which you turn a word that is not a noun into a noun. So most commonly this happens with adjectives and verbs. But I'm not really aware of a language that can do this, but there's absolutely nothing that says you wouldn't be able to do this with, say, adverbs or prepositions. So quite possible that somewhere out there is a language that can nominalize word types that are not verbs or adjectives. Klingon has 2 types, we and rach. So we, which is mostly equivalent to the English er or or suffix, forms a so-called agent noun. That's a noun that does an action. Agent and action are etymologically related words. So the agent noun is the person or thing that does something. So like a reader reads, a ladwe lads. Yeah, that was a horrible sentence. But yeah, that one, yes, that one maps fairly nicely, and that's called an agent noun. Raj is a more general case of nominalization. I don't know a particular term for this. But again, there is a similar concept in English with like ness, Asian, tude, itty. If I thought about it more, there are probably a few more. English has so many of these because, as we were just saying, English isn't one language, it's 3 languages wearing a trench coat. That's basically, that's the short way to say why there are so many nominalization suffixes in English. Mech could be called a final suffix, so final, that's what, that expresses the final goal of something you do. It comes from Latin finis, end. So in order to do something, in order to achieve a final goal, that is marked by mech. Now I have people heard it, I have heard people call it an instrumental. And that's a bit like what we were saying last time, I think, with the subjunctive, conjunctive versus conditional. These are related concepts and they kind of go together, but they are technically different. So an instrumental expresses rather what you do to achieve the final goal, whereas the final goal itself is, well, the final. So I have an example here to compare them. So instrumental is a common case in Slavic languages. Slovak has one, so a Slovak sentence, ja píšem perom, meaning I write with a pen. Ja is I, píšem is write in the first person singular form, so Slovak is a pro-drop language, just like Klingon, you could leave the pronoun out. And perom is the instrumental case of, is it pero? It's pero, which originally actually means feather. So through feather quill, it's now used to mean pen. And this form expresses that you use the pen, the noun here, to do the action expressed by the verb. Because in Klingon you have ritmech, ritwe velo. So in order to write, I use a pen. So the pen, or the usage, isn't marked as it is in Slovak. It's the goal that you have that is marked. And that's why this is really a final and not an instrumental. Now, on the other hand, Klingon doesn't have an instrument. So there isn't really a risk of mixing these up or misunderstanding these. So frankly, does it really matter if people call it instrumental? But yes, technically, very technically, this is incorrect and could be called a final suffix. We have 3 temporal suffixes, pa, de, vish, that all express some kind of time relation. If there are words that closely define these, I'm not aware of them, and I've never heard anybody use them. Then we have relativization. That's a word that says that we're doing something to turn something into a relative clause, also called an adjectival. What it does in a sentence is basically the same thing that an adjective does. So again, let's use the booklet. The black booklet, right? The word black defines it more closely. But I can also say the booklet that is black. And that relative clause does the exact same thing. So that's why it's also sometimes called an adjectival. Then bor, the suffix that does this, is called the relative marker. And the noun that the relative clause refers back to, in case booklet, is called the antecedent, if we're using technical language. Now in Klingon grammar discussions, it's usually termed the head noun. I think, was that in TKD already? I'm not entirely sure, but it's been called the head noun by Mark Okrand. So we usually follow that terminology. The thing is just that head noun as well that aren't as important for the discussion of Klingon, but still the more technical term is antecedent. All right, I read. Oh yeah, because the rest I've mostly covered. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we have judge, which can be called optative, but we had that in Mu. Chur we've discussed in Mu. A is an interrogative, which I think I've also covered somewhere. And as always, each time I'm trying to remember all type 9 suffixes, I'm missing one. Spruch, judge, chur. Judge, chur, a. More, thank you. So more is pretty much the same as the noun one, causal. So we can use the same word for that. Okay, and that was the grammar section. Does anybody have any questions before we continue?
Yes, just really quick. Are substantivization and nominalization like the same thing, or is one a subcategory of the other?
Nope, they are the same thing because it's not used much in English. English prefers the word noun, but substantive is an alternative for the word noun.
Okay.
I'm not entirely sure where there are two words.
Gotcha.
I just wanted to be a bit complete because particularly since there are so many German speakers in the Klingon communities and in German, Substantiv and Substantivierung are far more common. So if anybody ever directly translates that, you come across the word. What is the way I learned is that noun is the type of word while substantive is its role in the sentence. Well, that's not quite how I learned it because more than one role for a noun in a sentence. Right, yeah, I get what you're saying. I get what you're saying, just that, for the role in the sentence, I would have got object and the like as opposed to substantive. But there may be a point to that as well. All right, we have the internet. Oh, okay. So that's because the word now, they are actually mildly distinct in Latin, in the traditional Latin grammar discussion, where noun is has a bit of a wider meaning than sub. Okay, anything else, or shall we continue? Okay, right, so next section is syntax. Syntax is the study of sentence structure. So, we've gone from sounds in phonology to putting the sounds into syllables, to syllables that mean something, morphology to put them together into words. We use grammar to figure out how to correct words, and now we use syntax to put them together in a sentence. Suffixes versus suffixes is both. I've never heard suffixes with a C, but keep in mind I'm also not an English speaker, so this may be wrong. And again, hello internet. Okay. The plural suffixes with a C occasionally appears, but is not a standard plural and has no basis. So there you go, says Wiktionary. Yeah, right, so now we're putting together nouns into sentences with syntax. Some basic concepts. Word order is the correct order of elements in a sentence in a language. Some languages have very fixed word order, Klingon. So in English, when we have the man sees the book, if we turn this around, the book sees the man, that doesn't really make sense. The sentence would be the same. Pak ler lord means one thing, and lord ler pak means an entirely different thing. And there are, however, languages where word order is free. Usually, even those languages have a neutral word order, which is the most common one. That is, if you're not trying to emphasize anything, every other word order puts emphasis on things. So that's, for example, the case in Hungarian. The neutral word order is still subject, verb, object, but you can use any word order. It just puts the emphasis on something else. Yeah, sure. Oh, shit. I will have a look. How about now? Is this better? Okay, I'll leave it here for a moment and you let me know in a bit if it's better. Do I need to repeat anything I just said? Okay, no worries. Right, so word order is the correct order of elements in a sentence. There are languages that have fixed word order, like English Klingon. So we have a sentence here, the man sees the book, in Klingon pak ler lord. This is the correct order that says that a man is doing a seeing and the target of that is a book. And if I were to turn this around, it would mean something else. The book sees the man is no longer the same sentence. It means something else, and it is quite nonsensical, just like in Klingon, Lord ler pak. Since when do books have eyes? But there are languages that have a free word order. These languages still typically have a neutral word order, so one word order is preferred and is neutral and has no additional connotations. So for example, Hungarian has mostly free word order, but the neutral one is still subject, verb, object. So if I were to say the man sees the book in Hungarian, I would still be using that same word order to not imply anything. But the moment I want to put an emphasis on one element in the sentence, I can put it in a different place. So any word order is possible, and they just put different emphasis on different elements. So that's also an option, but not in Klingon. Was that better now? Perfect. Okay, then we can go on to role or syntactic role. That's an overarching term for what a word does in a sentence. So taking pak ler lord again, both pak and lord are nouns when it comes to part of speech. But their role in the sentence is different. Lord is the subject of the sentence, the person or thing that does the verb, whereas pak is the object, the thing or person something is being done to. So subject and object are syntactic roles, and lord and pak that are usually filled by. And what goes a bit with that is the term verb-centric. That is a community term, so used by the Klingon community to express the tendency of the Klingon language to use verbs where English has nouns or has the option to use nouns. This has gotten a bit weakened, I feel, over time now that, if you look at any new word list, you find that the majority of the newly recorded words are nouns, and usually the majority of the words we get. So this is, I think, getting watered down a bit, but with earlier vocabulary, this was really, really strong, where you would very often have to recast sentences, English sentences, to be able to express them in Klingon only using words, rather verbs rather than nouns. Okay, let's go into different kinds of sentence bits. So the first one is phrase. A phrase in this terminology is a part of a sentence. It's not a sentence on its own, but it is a part of a sentence that fills a particular role in a sentence, and that within a sentence acts as a grammatical unit. So for example, I have this this whole thing here is a sentence. Last week I was reading the new book I got for my birthday because I was sick in bed. So last week would be an adverbial phrase because it tells me, in this case, when the rest of the sentence happened. And would be an adverbial phrase, also called an adverbial expression, but we get back. Was reading is the verbal or predical phrase. We'll get to the predical bit because that together acts as the verb, or the predicate really. And the new book I got for my birthday is all one nominal phrase or noun phrase, because this fulfills the same role as if I had just a noun there. Last week I was reading a book with just a noun in English, the article, because it's not possible without most of the time, is just as much a correct sentence. So because this entire thing fulfills the same role as a noun, phrases are the role they fulfill. So adverbial phrase acts like an adverb, verbal phrase acts like a verb, nominal phrase acts like a noun. The next step up from that are clauses. Clauses are defined that they need to have a so-called finite verb. That is a verb that actually, you know what, scratch this, may not be finite in every, they contain a verb of some kind. Clauses, so they're the that is the minimum definition. A clause needs to contain at least a verb. Some clauses can stand on their own. Those are called independent clauses. In this sentence, I was reading the new book I got for my birthday as an independent clause, because that alone is a correct sentence. But because I was sick in bed is a dependent or subordinate clause, because that alone can't really stand on its own. Now, of course, in colloquial language, it will. If somebody asks you, "Hey, why did you read the book all last week?" You will probably just answer, "Because I was sick in bed." You'll leave off the rest because the information of what you were doing because you were sick in bed is already there. You no need to repeat it. But on a very technical level, this cannot stand alone. And then I got for my birthday is the relative clause or adjectival clause. We've already discussed, but a relative or adjectival clause, of course, a type of dependent or subordinate clause. I got for my birthday, again, on its own is not a correct sentence. And then from there on, we go on to sentences. Now, this part of the sentence, I was reading the new book. So a sentence that really just contains one clause made up of an optional subject, a necessary verb, and an optional object, that is a simple sentence. If I put a sentence with at least one subordinate or dependent clause, that is a complex sentence. And if I add simple sentences to one another by means of and or, that would be called a compound sentence. So that actually is Klingon terminology, because that is KD. Those are chapter headings or section headings. Now, to go about the constituents of a sentence, this will include some terminology that you already know and that I've mentioned a million times, because it's difficult to discuss grammar in any way without them. So in a simple sentence like "the man opens," the man is the subject, the person or thing who does something. The door is the object, the person or thing that has something done to it, with the something being expressed by the verb. Now, there are sentences where the subject is absent or a bit questionable. So in English, "it is raining." English always needs a subject. So while the general definition of complete clause or sentence is that have at least a verb, There are languages where it also needs to have a subject, and English is one of them. So in sentences like "it is raining," I mean, we would never say the weather is raining, or the sky is raining, or the cloud is raining. That's strange. So we're not really sure what is doing the raining. So we have this "it" here to describe it, and that is called a dummy subject. There are, however, languages that can do this without a subject. So "shechtach" is equivalent to "it is raining." You see, there is, sorry, I'm marking the wrong side. There is absolutely no subject here. And that is called, so Klingon would be called a null subject, a language in which it is possible for a sentence to not have a subject. Oh yeah, there it is. Now, in a sentence like "the door opens," the door is still the subject, right? But at the same time, the door isn't really doing the thing, right? A door doesn't open itself. Being opened by a person, an animal, a mechanism, wind, or maybe if we're in a ghost story, you know, ooh, that's a sign the spooky ghost is coming. The door opened as if by itself, but we all know it can't do it by itself. So in that case, it was the ghost. So in this case, grammatically, that is still the subject. But when I go to the meaning, it's not the door that does the opening. So in sentences, we sometimes also talk about semantic rules. So again, syntax is sentence structure. So syntactic role is the role an element plays in the structure of a sentence, whereas semantics, which is meaning of words, so semantic role is the more meaning-based role of something in a sentence. And semantically, so by meaning alone, since the door doesn't open itself, it's not really the subject, it is what we call the patient. So in this case, the semantic and the names to them, and the semantic role of something that has done to it, like the door in this case, is patient. Now let's say we add who opens the door. So make the sentence a bit longer. The door is opened by the man. So again, syntactically, the door is the subject. The man is a sort of object. But the door isn't actually doing anything. So the door remains the patient. And now we get the man who's actually doing the thing. So he's the agent. That's same agent as we had earlier, an agent. So subject and object are syntactic roles. Patient and agent are semantic roles. Most of the time, these are the same. And it's actually interesting in Klingon, they're more generally the same. Because Klingon, contrary to the English passive, so if you look at the man opens the door, where patient and agent match subject and object, whereas the door is opened by the man, it switches around. Klingon would express this second one through an indefinite subject, if at all. So the door would remain the object. However, then on the other has verbs where the subject really is still the patient. So one of them would, for example, be yach, meaning be taken away. If somebody is taken away, they're not doing the thing, so they are the subject, but still the patient. All right, and with objects, we have two kinds. So in the sense like the man gives to the child, we have the direct object, corresponds to the accusative object mostly in case languages. And it's called the direct object because it's directly next to the verb. In English, it's directly after the verb, and it's directly in front of the verb. Whereas to the child is the indirect object, dative object in case languages, typically at least. Missed it. And that's called the indirect object because it is separated from the word by at least, it is separated from the verb by at least the direct object, and typically, also by a preposition, in this case to. Okay, and then we get to the predicate. I've hinted at that a few times. So predicate is the syntactic role of the verb. So as you've just seen, when we talk about roles in a sentence, we no longer talk about nouns, because nouns can have several sentences. And equivalent to that, the role of the verb in a sentence is called the predicate. Now, why do you not hear that much? And why is it pretty much never used in Klingon grammar discussions? So in English, it's fairly simple, because in English, only verbs can be predicates. It's impossible for the English language to have a predicate that is not. And the same, or that doesn't at least include a verb. And this is the same for pretty much any Western Indo-European language. So most languages that English native speakers would generally get around to learning, it's the same thing. But there are other languages that can have non-verbal predicates. Just about anything can be a predicate. So for example, Russian can do nominal predicates. Voin, Klingon. The warrior is a Klingon. Voin means warrior. I've added the dash here. That's not usual with sentences. Simple, but you could almost argue that this is more commonly done in writing with longer predicates, more complicated ones. So I've joked before with someone that Russian really has punctuation, a punctuational predicate. But yeah, so the warrior is the subject of the sentence, and Klingon, the Klingon is the predicate. And just like in Klingon, there are no the and the is what we add in. Similarly, Russian can have adjectival predicates. So Klingon chrabr, Klingon brave, quite literally, meaning a Klingon is brave or the Klingon is brave. You can already see a similarity. English predicate in both of them is. So this all comes down to the fact that the Russian verb for to be is defective, meaning not all forms of it exists. It's the present tense that doesn't exist. If we did any of this in the past tense, things would look a little different. Prepositional, so a preposition as a predicate is something that probably a few more languages, but the only one that I know that Middle Egyptian, so apologize for the slightly out there example. Oreret I nes. Oreret is a type of crown. This I suffix marks a first singular possessive, so my, just like Klingon wedge. So this is my crown. N is a preposition meaning to or for. A few other things. Prepositions are generally very difficult to translate. And S is a similar type of suffix to this one, just in this case it's not possessive, but marks more a sort of object. So NS means to her or for her. This marks she. And so literally it's my crown to her, or more idiomatically in English, my crown shall be hers. That N here would be the predicate. Pronominal, there I like to use Hebrew as an example because the structure is actually very similar to Klingon. So here it is written in Hebrew, which is of course from right to left. The rest goes left to right. So halochem hu Klingon. Ha is the definite article, so the, lochem means warrior, hu means he, and Klingon is clear. So the warrior, he is a Klingon, which is pretty similar to how Klingon, right? We just don't have an equivalent to the e. And then adverbial, I've again gone to Middle Egyptian. So I also like this sentence because it's very Klingon, right? Iu mut emcheri min. EU as an an adverbial part, a bit difficult to translate because it can do a lot of different things. Mut means death, is a preposition meaning in this case. Her means sight, means a lot of things, but one of them is sight. This E is the same thing as this E, so my sight. And min means today. So the whole thing means death is in my sight today, and the predicate of this is this EU, this adverbial particle. You have an adverbial predicate in this case. And yeah, with Klingon, with sentences like shuvwe jich or shuvwe rach, the predicate would be jich or rach. So you could describe these as Klingons having predicates. All that lengthy explanation only by but Mark Okrand that. So I found it really helpful to think of that way, not in the least because I knew some Hebrew before starting to on. So if this is helpful to you, then yeah, I think it can be helpful to think of it that way. But again, Mark hasn't called it that, so don't say this as a definite thing. He might think of it differently. But yeah, from a pure descriptive point, I would argue that this is a possible description of Klingon. Yeah. Adverbial, I've mentioned this when we're talking about adverbs. So again, the more general way this is used in grammar terminology is an adverb is a part of speech, and adverbial is the role it plays in the sentence, the syntactic role. This is different. It's important to make this different usually because adverb form adverbial. So earlier on we had the sentence last week. Right? Last is an adjective, week is a noun, but last week together put in front of the sentence plays the same role as an adverb, so adverbial. Also called adverbial expression, adverbial phrase, or all of these are possible. I think I said adverbial clause earlier. I meant so oops. This is yes. What we've mentioned before is that this is contentious because TKD uses adverbial and adverb as synonyms. This is also not that uncommon in English language. Distinction isn't always clear. But in this case, it means that if you're going to call something, oh yeah, I've got some examples here. So usually adverbials can express time, location, purpose, cause, a few other things. But the important thing that I want to point out is that none of these words are adverbs. In is a preposition, 5 is a noun, is under is a preposition, the is an article, table is a noun, etc., etc. So you can form these adverbials from words that are not adverbs. But yes, if you're going to do this with the Klingon equivalent, so for example, ben, you will come across people who insist no, var ben is a timestamp because that's what Mark called them. I would argue that a timestamp is a type of adverbial because that is what adverbial usually means. Yeah, everybody has to decide for themselves how they handle. And the same goes for location. We have these location nouns. So you will again have people who will argue that locations like under the table, rash bing dak, would not be an adverbial. Yeah, don't want to convince you of my point of view, but I can only explain my point of view. And as far as I can tell, the only argument against, but Mark Okrand didn't say it was that, and Mark Okrand only described adverbs as adverbials and not timestamps and locations. Yeah.
It's coming and going, but the sound issue came back a little bit.
Okay. Was the last part okay? It may
Yes.
also have been coming and going because I was talking more loud and less loud.
Yes, the last part was fine, though. I did write down to ask you to perhaps go over the adverbial predicate in Middle Egyptian again, if possible. I think you cut out for a very critical second there, unfortunately.
Okay. It's not the. I use this example because I like the meaning. Death is in my sight today, so much, so similar to today is a good day today. But in the end, it wasn't a very nice predicate. Can't translate EU, and nobody can translate EU. It's one of these particles that in a lot of sentences don't get translated, and we call it an adverb basically because we don't know what else to call it. It's a non. It never change. It's not. It doesn't get inflected, which is usually one of the defining traits of adverbs. So yeah, there isn't that much to say about it, but we classify this as an adverb by definition and a sentence with an adverbial predicate. And I should probably have chosen a better example. Entirely
But I shouldn't be able to look at death is in my sight today and know what ew is in that. In other words.
No,
Okay, great.
really, because it really isn't in here. I mean, it is here in the is, because again, Middle Egyptian doesn't have the verb to be, but that doesn't mean that EU means is or means to be.
Right. Okay.
It just, in this particular case, that's what it maps onto in the translation, but it's not what it means.
Yes.
It means a lot of different things. It's quite often used for introducing all kinds of sentences, and so you can have sentences with verbal predicates that are still introduced by EU, and then that just means a slightly different thing. So yeah, yes, I'm sorry to explain the concept of adverbial predicates. It was a very poorly chosen example. I just saw the translation and said, yeah, that's the example I'm using. Okay, so that was syntax. Gets us to semantics. Any more questions? Oh, there was something in the chat. Oh, right, Wach was also saying, I'm cutting out for a second every other sentence. I'm sorry. I don't usually have that sort of audio issues. Yes, so I was saying that I would argue that in Klingon pronouns can be predicates. This is not what Mark Okrand has said. Other people might disagree. Might also disagree by how helpful it is to look at it that way. To some people, it might be more helpful. Jirk translated I or I am. If that is more helpful for you in understanding the language, I would argue that's more important than what the grammatically, technically accurate description is. I found it helpful to think of it that way. Okay, was there anything else that came? Okay, in the sentence shishtach, how do we know it's a pronoun isn't required? Could it also theoretically have a dummy subject? Not a null object, by the way, a null subject. That actually doesn't, a null subject just demands that the subject doesn't need to be explicitly stated. So even if we say, oh, usually there should have an och there, that would still qualify it for null subject. Those aren't those don't necessarily exclude one another. But the reason we know that there isn't really is that it's never said with a pronoun or a subject. So in this particular case, we kind of never say shishtach och. And if we were to do that, somebody would ask us, what is och? Right? Okay, any other question? Okay, the last sections are short. So we get to semantics. This is the study of meaning. I've mentioned that before, and now we get to a few words about meanings. There are a few different ways of representing meaning. So gloss is the first term here. This is usually the most detailed description of a word. It's also used in the expression glossed translation or glossing translation, where you take the sentence apart bit by bit. This is what I was already doing here in the predicate explanation. So these things here, shown by the typewriter font, are glossing translation. Here's a more extreme example. Etnal, which has been glossed as person who married into the... There is an English term for that. It's in-law. So we could use that as well, but since this is the gloss we've been given, this is the gloss for this word. And yeah, the suffixes and prefixes are explained like this. So which, first singular possessive, vi, first singular agent to third singular patient. In this case often more common to use agent patient, but in this case you could also use subject object and then C for l'air. A little thing here is that gloss, the original meaning of the word gloss, or let's say the far older meaning, something like margin. And if you look up the Klingon word for gloss, you get jewesh, which is explained as what's the exact definition given that we were given? Let me find that before I misquote it. Yes, it's jewesh. All right, and that was accompanied by the common definition, like would be found in a dictionary, but a quick tag to give an idea of. That's a little bit annoying because that's not how gloss is commonly used, particularly in the concept of glossing translation. Yeah, I don't think gloss is the best definition or gloss for jewesh, going by that definition. The definition is what's usually found in the dictionary. So that's going to be a single word if the word maps neatly enough for that to be possible. And it's a longer explanation if for several words. Oh wait, you're probably not seeing my camera anyway, so that's pointless. If that's what is needed. And then sometimes when we speak of the translation of a word, then that is usually in context. That can often be the same as the definition. So for example, for bikr, it means water. It pretty much only means water. So the definition and the translation are the same. For a bit of a cheap example, makler, the definition I think that we were given as priest, but the translation in context may be priestess. So yeah, that's a bit of a cheap example because Klingon just generally doesn't translate these, but when you get to verbs, you'll find a few more interesting examples. Ja and jat, for example. I think, wait, which one was it? I know, jat has been glossed as say. But okay, yeah, ja hasn't been glossed as say, and nevertheless in context, say may be the best translation. Right. Oh yeah, expressions. So expression is a bit of a general term for some kind of combination of words said together. And there are different types. So a saying is an expression of wisdom that has the subtype of aphorism, which has the subtype of proverb or adage. And myself, because I forgot what. Right, an aphorism is a general observational truth expressed in a memorable fashion, whereas a proverb is a very simple, usually traditional, and very widely known aphorism. getting close to splitting hairs by distinguishing these, I would say. A figure of speech is a general term for any use of non-literal, a subtype of that is very common in Klingon. Simile, adjective as nouns, happy, for example. Similes may be very literal, like well, can't think of an English example right now, but Scottish Gaelic example I'm really fond of is Chofliuch Riscaraf, meaning as wet as a cormorant. Cormorant is a seabird, but contrary to a lot of other, it doesn't have waterproof feathers, so it actually gets wet when diving. So that's why you can be as wet as a cormorant. And sometimes they're seemingly a bit more nonsensical. Be about it. If you know the longer expression, you know where that comes from. But yeah. An idiom is also a sort of expression using non-literal speech. So it's a little more restricted than figure of speech, because in an idiom, typically not a single word is used in the literal sense. But more important is the adjective idiomatic, because that has two important or interesting. The first one is just the use of idioms, but more interesting is it's used to say to express the following of the natural conventional way of speaking a language. So sometimes you may come across something that somebody says that isn't wrong. It's not grammatical. It sounds strange. So for example, there's nothing grammatically wrong about saying I did. We'll even fully understand. But the idiomatic way of saying it in English is I made a mistake. So I did a mistake. It's always going to be a bit. So yeah, that's the more interested, or the more I would say the more interesting meaning of idiomatic. You'll come across that in Klingon when yes, Klingons would probably more idiomatically put it this way or that way. It's of course a little difficult to say because we don't have a whole lot to listen to. So sometimes we have to make it up ourselves. And then ritual speech is a fixed expression that's used in fixed context. That goes a little further than we typically think of as ritual. Hello, or something like when in England you say, and the correct answer is how do you do, rather than oh fine, thanks, I'm doing fine. That all of that is types of ritual speech, and within that we have a toast, which is used to when drinking, and fairly important in Klingon. Oh yeah. Okay, that was that. Any questions there?
Yes, please. Just first, out of sheer curiosity, you cut out. So, what is the first half of the ritualistic where you answer, "How do you do"?
How do you do? How do you do?
Ah, okay.
The question and the answer are the same. I don't know if much still. Scots don't use it, and that's the only part of the UK I've ever lived. So maybe TJ can comment on that a little bit more. But it's what I learned in school. Mm-hmm. If any English person ever asked me how do you do, that the correct answer is how do you do. Mm-hmm. Not go into details about how you actually. If they actually want to know, they'll ask how are you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, and then for idiomatic language, insofar as explaining how things are normally done, I once was helping actually a German what's the word, exchange student, And I said,
Mhm.
oh, it's not blue big porcelain bowl or something like that. It's big blue.
Big blue porcelain, yes.
Yeah. And then she was like, well, why? And I don't know. So would that be an example of idiomatic?
Yes, that is, well, that's bordering on, because there is actually a grammatical rule, I think it's called order of adjectives, where most languages that can chain adjectives have a preferred order. Now, I'm lucky I didn't have to learn this, but I know people learning English had to of the correct order of
Hmm.
adjective categories in English by heart. Um, I was lucky I skipped that one. Um, so there is a rule about it, which may that then you could argue that it's actually grammar. Entirely sure, but it straddles
Okay.
grammar
Yeah.
and idiomatic speech, but it could also very well be idiomatic. But you could have told her translate it in German, and one of the orders will seem wrong.
Oh. Huh.
Yeah, because German does the same thing. The order may be different. Big blue porcelain bowl, große blaue Porzellanschüssel, die blaue große Porzellan. Blaue große, blue big porcelain bowl sounds a bit strange in German. Just
Oh, interesting. Okay, and then my last question, I think this was just a sound cutting out again, but
yeah.
which part of the gloss in the dictionary which part of the definition of gloss do you have concerns about?
I have concerns about that. Usually, I'm more used to gloss being used for a very detailed explanation for a word, whereas when Mark Okrand gave us the Klingon word for gloss, the explanation that came with it is kind of the opposite of that. It's a quick tag to say to give a general impression of.
Okay.
So that's the bit I have a little bit of a concern about, because it's not how I'm the meaning of gloss in the sense of language translation. And TJ wrote, I have never heard how do you do you that I can think of. Also now I'm sure you often people saying how are you actually want to know. Okay, so there you go. I learned English in the 90s from a teacher who probably learned it in the 60s. So I may also have some antiquated knowledge. I never use how because I've never heard anybody else use it either. But it's what I was taught. So this sort of thing also changes. But even then, even if you say, so generally, I'm in Germany, when somebody asks you how you are, um, you, they expect an actual answer. But in a lot of languages, I was also told that if somebody asks you that in the US, you should just answer fine. They're not expecting you to actually tell them how you're doing. So even that would be a form of ritual speech. And what else? I only ever hear it from people. Yeah, probably. Definitely remember one case of a Scot using it. Oh, how do you do? Something like that. So, but yeah, let's say that was at least once a thing, and then that would have been a type of ritual speech. Okay, and I know when we started this, I said the talk section. Now it has 6 because something else came up, and I thought I'd add a language variety. It's not overly long, so be through that relatively quickly. Yeah, because people speak languages in different ways. We've already mentioned a few times the differences between British and American English, or the difference between the English I learned in the 90s and the English that I heard actually spoken in Scotland, in this case, in the 2010s. So, with that, an accent is an individual way of pronunciation. Now, very commonly used to a foreign accent. So you might say to a accent English. We all know what is meant, but no, they don't. They still have an accent. Similarly, it may be used for a regional accent, but then one has to keep in mind that also the standard pronunciation of a language is an accent. So everybody has an accent. It may be the standard accent, but that is an accent. A sociolect is a variety of languages. So this may be social strata. That's generally the strongest one. So when you can tell by someone's speech that they're lower class, middle class, that's a sociolect. But also age-related language is a sociolect. You know, when a teenager speaks internet jargon, or, you know, a 30-something-year-old speaks jargon from 20 years ago, or well, maybe 15 years ago, those are also sociolects. An ethnolect is a variety of. A good example for that would be African American Vernacular English in the US. It's pretty much exclusively spoken by African Americans. Now, these often, because ethnic groups often overlap with social groups, ethnolects also overlap with sociolects. So I get the impression this is changing, correct me if I'm wrong, but when I first started watching American films or tuning into American news, Black people in politics, for example, or at least I got the impression, typically did not speak AAVE because as a sociolect, it's generally associated with somewhat lower class. As a Black American, you wanted to rise to a higher class, you wouldn't speak this variety anymore. I get the impression that it's changing, which would be nice. So yeah, this can overlap because particularly minorities are so generally part of a particular social group in a particular social class, and typically let's be frank, typically it's a lower one. So ethnolects are rarely prestigious. A regiolect is a variety associated with region. There are also the terms topolect, geolect, and regionalect. Frankly, I had never heard of before I looked this up. To give an exact definition, regiolect is by far the most common one. Yeah, that's probably the most obvious one. If you're from a different language differently, you're from Great Britain or from the US, but either of these places, or, you know, other English language speaking places, Australia and Canada have. But even within these places, now within Canada, I really know, but even within the US, even I can tell a speaker from New England from a speaker from Texas time. So that's a regiolect. And then an idiolect is an individual's unique way of speaking. Most of us have something, no, really everybody has an idiolect, just how notable it may vary quite a bit. It's usually a bit stronger in a foreign language because you eventually pick up things from different sources that don't really go together. Right, a register in a language is a variety for a particular purpose or in a particular situation. And we speak of low and high registers. A low register is an informal one, a high register is a formal one. This may come with a variety of things. So a lot of people may change their pronunciation. My slightly exaggerated RP right here is probably a form of register. I don't think I speak quite that posh in most situations. It's also word choice. Like the very obvious example is you're not going to use swear words in a business environment because that's swear words are part of a lower form of register. Also, how you structure your sentences. You might be prone to using more complicated structures in higher registers. And this is something we really a lot. If you speak different with your friends than with your parents, particularly as a teenager, then you were already employing registers. You are probably speaking differently to your friends, to your boss. And generally, in a lot of languages, put any sort of emphasis on the inability to switch registers is considered a bit of a sign of lack of education. So it's not. So being able to not switch out of a low register seen as negatively as a lack of education. Not being able to high register seen as arrogant, up nose up in the air sort of thing. Part of both register and social act is slang. Now, slang in English is a really wide word for informal vocabulary. This can range from things that are informal but still common in everyday language. So, for example, saying gonna instead of going to. It's very common. I don't know how overly clear I have to want to speak to actually say going to. So yeah, it can be very common, and it can reach all the way down to vulgar. This doesn't even necessarily need to be swear words. There are struggling to think of English examples now, but French is really replete with these. French has a lot of words they're not vulgar in the sense of that they describe something vulgar, something insulting or anything. They, through association of some kind, is vulgar. Two subtypes of this are cant. Cant is a type of speech that is used to explicitly exclude outsiders. Most of this is something like thieves' cant. So it's almost a secret language that makes sure that you can speak about the person you're about to pick in their presence, and the goal is that they don't understand. Interesting thing with cant is that there is really, the more it gets, the more it spreads, the more it gets used, the more it is overheard. So it's really fun to see how a lot of mildly informal words today were often from thieves' cant 100. At least I find that interesting. Jargon is specialized vocabulary that is usually used by a field of study or by a hobby group or something like that. And the difference here is that it doesn't exist with the express intent to exclude outsiders. It just often happens as a side effect. For example, I'm a hobby sailor. I've heard more than once the accusation nautical talk is just unnecessarily complicated. Landlubbers don't understand it, but that really isn't the case. Most of the very necessary vocabulary. Jib sheet is far faster to say than the rope that controls the angle of the innermost sail in front of the foremost sails. Controls the angle of the sail in front. That's too long. That's a jib sheet. So the result is that people are being intent. Now you see the word argot on these. The French word argot is an equivalent to cant. So that's an almost parallel language that has the express intent of excluding outsiders. But in English, you will also find or jargon, and it gets even worse. This is the technical definition, at least cant and jargon, but you will find these mixed up. This in everyday speech, this distinction is not adhered. Right. Oh, and I forgot one thing on here. If you switch between them, that is called code switching. So again, if you switch registers when talking to your boss versus when talking to your friends, that's a code switching. If what a lot of Germans do, you speak regionalect, a regional version of the language with your family, but the standard language at work. That's right. Now, maybe you were thinking, well, I expected a word to show up, still hasn't. Then that word's going to come now. Dialect. The reason I bring it up last is that it really has more than one definition to it. So the most common one is all of the above. That dialect is just an overarching term for all kinds of. However, I rarely, if ever, have anybody heard it that way. Far more common is as a synonym of so a regional dialect. But then in a lot of languages that have very strong regional variety, just to be clear here, by very strong, I mean kind of variety in German, in Italian, in Arabic. English, by comparison, is all very similar. In those languages, you sometimes hear it used for the stronger geographical variety of language that contrast with the more regional form of the standard language. The closest English equivalent to then call Scots a dialect, yes, we could argue whether it's a. Let's leave that argument out for a moment. Versus the standard Scottish English. Standard Scottish English with a few of its own words, a notably different pronunciation, and maybe a few turns of phrase that are more Scottish speakers are far more likely to progress English speakers. So in German, for example, the dialect would be used for really, like, let's say, strong Bavarian, really the Bavarian regional, let's say, language. Whereas regiolect would then be standard German spoken with a Bavarian accent. So, yeah, dialect has a few meanings. And I've already brought this up since we're at it, and it's going the difference between dialect and language. And one of the main reasons it's so hard to define, oh, this is where I had code switching, sorry, is the dialect continuum. This is the concept that you have a language or several of them, which are, and varieties of that language or languages that are ordered in a simplified view along a line, right? So people from the region of A can understand the people in the region of B. They can sort of communicate with people from C, but from D on, communication is not possible. So everybody can always communicate perfectly with their neighbors, communicate imperfectly with the neighbors of the neighbors, then communication becomes very difficult, if not impossible. This is called a dialect continuum. This does exist in real life, so the way Romance, Portuguese, Southern Italian, German to Dutch used to be a dialect continuum until as little as 100. But the most beautiful example in real life that I'm aware of are the Iroquoian languages of the original Five Nations, from Seneca to Mohawk. As far as my understanding goes, from the neighboring nations could easily understand each other, and then it got a little. Streams could understand each other. It's really difficult to research these days, so I found very different opinions on whether Seneca speakers can understand each other or not. But definitely, even the people who said they can understand, communication isn't easy. So there will be some misunderstanding and some struggles. Yeah, and the problem is, if you wanted to define a language, you ask the people from A say, well, people from B speak the same language as me, so the language ends here. Then the people from B say, but we understand the people here. And then the people from C say, but we understand the people from D, so the border is here. And then we get to E, and I can understand people from E and C, but not from B, so the border is here. And it becomes impossible to actually define where one language ends and the other starts. And that's why this definition of language versus dialect can be so extremely difficult and have some argument. So you may also have heard the saying, a language is just a dialect with an army. I slightly dislike this because, not because it's so wrong, but because it often gets misunderstood as there being force involved, which most of the time is not necessary. We want to communicate. So if we're in the same country and therefore more likely to have to communicate with each other, we're going to automatically try and make this possible. So yeah, what that saying really means more is that the moment we then, because country borders aren't decided on language. So if we now go in and say, well, this is the border between E and F, these are all the same country, then these dialects are going to move closer to each other on each border. So imagine now, for example, people from A, this is where the capital is. So their dialect stays the same. They've declared their dialect Achol. Then the dialect from B is maybe going to approach it a bit. The dialect from C, which is not that intelligible, needs to approach a bit stronger. Maybe in D, where they really don't understand the people from A anymore, they're going to become bilingual, both. Whereas the dialect of E might just die out and leave a slightly colored version of A behind. Whereas in the other one, maybe a bit of an artificial standard language, different from all the dialects develop, and then they all just develop regionally colored variations of that standard dialect. And now all of a sudden, look at that. We have the language of A, we have the language of D, which is now so isolated, clearly a language. We have this new language of the second country here, and I said J, when I drew this, I said that in J, maybe the original dialect also stays. So all of a sudden, we can define languages. And that, I think, is a far better illustration of that saying, a language is just a dialect with an army, because that's far more likely what happens. Now, that's not to say that never involved. Of course it is, but it doesn't have to be. And what I dislike about the saying is that it suggests this so heavily. And that was it. Questions?
I was just clapping on mute, which is just a new level of tech. But no, I have no questions. I just wanted to say thank you again. This was so incredibly helpful. And it's going to be really useful to go back and look at when I'm so confused by other people's conversations. So thank you.
You're very welcome. Happy if it ends up helping. Didn't expect this to get quite this long and extensive, but the moment I started thinking about words I have heard people use, it got long. Yeah, thank you for the attention, for sticking with me. And there will be the written glossary out. There are a few things I want to change after the talk, after a few more conversations. But then I'll find a way to publish this somewhere, somehow, so that will also be a more faster way to look it up, to look up things, because contrary to a YouTube video, it will have a search function. Okay, last chance for questions, comments, anything you think should be explained differently. Yeah, if you think of any comments later, do let me know. All right, yeah, if you think of any questions later, you know where to find me. And thank you for your attention again.